The next two sessions, I'm going to be focusing on the Civil War, the final climactic chapter in our story of early U.S. history. Today I'm going to be focusing specifically on a side-by-side comparison of North and South in terms of their relative advantages and disadvantages, as well as some of their wartime goals and strategies. Also take a look at some new technology from the Industrial Revolution that will play a role in this war that we haven't seen in previous wars. So before we get started, let's remind ourselves who the players are in this story of the Civil War. We've got North versus South, but more specifically the United States, or the Union, versus the self-declared Confederate States of America. And of course, keep in mind that the Confederacy is made up of 11 of the 15 slave-owning states that are part of the United States at this point. 4 slave-owning states, remember Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, 4 southern states, all slave-owning states who remained loyal to the Union. So when we speak of the Confederacy, we're not talking about all of the slave-owning states, just those 11 of the lower South, and not counting these what we call border states. So just kind of keep in mind who the players are in this story. When we talk about the term strategic balance, we're referring basically to the advantages and disadvantages that each side in a war has over the other. And of course, when we look at North and South, we see some obvious advantages and disadvantages right away, even at first glance. And these advantages can be broken down into 2 types of advantages: quantitative and qualitative. A quantitative advantage, anything that can be expressed in numeric form. So many thousands of troops, so many miles of railway lines, so many dollars available in the bank, number of personnel available for military duty. Anything that can be expressed in terms of a number, tons of cargo, sacks of grain, anything that can be expressed as a number is going to be a quantitative item. And the North has quantitative advantages in abundance in pretty much every possible area of things that can be quantified. The North has an advantage over the South. These are physical things, tangible. You can touch it. You can see it. It's there. It has a physical presence, and the North has a lot of these things. Manpower, industry, transportation, finance, military, all these things. North has a distinct advantage over the South. We'll talk about a few of these in detail. Particularly manpower is going to be one of the most important advantages that the North has. And this is, you can't fight a war without people. You need soldiers on the battlefield. And the North has a very distinct advantage over the South in terms of manpower. The number of people or men available for duty on the battlefield. Of course, today manpower refers both to men and women. This is, of course, the early or the mid 19th century. So when we talk about manpower, we're just talking about male soldiers, adult males available for military service. At any rate, when we look at some numbers here, we see that in the beginning of the war, both sides had relatively equal size armies. Both the United States Army and the Confederate Army were in the neighborhood of 200,000 men in uniform. And that stayed pretty close throughout the early years of the war. Both sides recruited new recruits and replacements for losses of casualties at about the same rate over this first few years of the war. So both armies grew in size from that around 200,000. They both grew in size at a relatively the same pace over the first couple of years. But at a certain point, they began to split. The United States Army continued to grow, whereas the Confederate Army got smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is the result of the manpower advantage that the North has. At the beginning of the war, in 1861, there were in the neighborhood of 5.5 million whites living in the South. That's total number. Men, women, and children. Total number of white people living in the South, about 5.5 million. And in addition, there was an additional 4 million slaves. In the North, there were more than 21 million whites. So again, we see about a 4-to-1 advantage that the North has over the South in terms of manpower. Now, of course, not all of these people are going to be serving in the military. We're talking total numbers. Only adult white males are going to be serving in the military initially on both sides. Later on, of course, part of the United States Army's increase in strength will be the result of active recruitment of black soldiers to serve as well. So we'll see the U.S. Army tapping other resources, not just white males, for military service. And the South, of course, will never take advantage of that resource. So again, we see that in terms of manpower, there are far more men available for military service in the North than there are in the South. But initially, that advantage isn't really a factor because both sides start out about the same. This turning point here is the Battle of Gettysburg. We'll talk about that later on in the next session. We start talking about some key battles. But this Battle of Gettysburg is a turning point. After this turning point, the South is less and less able to replace their losses. Both sides take heavy losses in every battle. But initially they've got the manpower reserves to replace those losses. After Gettysburg, the South is unable to replace its losses, and after every battle, they have fewer and fewer men available to fight. And whereas the North will continue to recruit and continue to tap into their manpower reserves, and their army will grow larger and larger, even as the South Army diminishes in size. So again, manpower is one of the most important advantages that the North has in this war. In terms of transportation, we've talked about railroads, so we're not going to go into that in any depth right now. Just kind of look at the map to remind ourselves what a transportation advantage that the North has over the South. We see here the railroad network in the North far more extensive than it is in the South, and the same is true, of course, with canals and roads. The transportation network in the North is far more elaborate and complex than it is in the South. And the advantage here is that the North will be able to move troops and supplies from where they are produced or recruited to where they are needed in the space of just a few days. So troops that are recruited up here in Maine or Vermont can be put on a train and sent down to the front lines in just a couple days, whereas the South is going to have a much more difficult time moving these troops with their limited transportation resources. Same thing with the supplies. Uniforms and tents and blankets that are being produced at our New England textile mills will be loaded on trains and be able to send them to wherever they are needed in a relatively short space of time. So transportation is going to be a huge advantage in terms of moving things around, and that's important in a war, is to get the personnel, all those millions of men that are available for war, to get those men where they're needed. Transportation is the key to that. In addition to manpower and transportation advantages, the North also has industrial advantages. And we've talked a lot about how northern industries have grown and developed over the past couple of decades, especially during the Industrial Revolution. We see northern industry has the capacity to produce almost everything that an army would need over the course of a war. The southern industry at this point is very minimal, almost non-existent. There's just a few factories and workshops in the South that produce a limited amount of goods, mostly oriented toward agriculture. Whereas northern industry is far more diverse and far more extensive. We see thousands of factories in the North producing an array of goods and products, pretty much everything that the North will need to fight a war. Finance is another big important category in terms of fighting a war. Northern economy is based on commerce and trade, and as such, finance and banking are going to be a big part of that economic activity. Whereas in the South, the plantation agriculture-based economy doesn't have nearly the need for financial institutions that the North does. So there's not as many banks in the South. There's not as much cash available on hand. Most of the wealth in the South is tied up in land and slaves, real estate, the big plantations. That's where their wealth is tied up. They don't have a lot of cash on hand, so fewer banks to manage financial transactions, and fewer amount of or smaller amount of actual money on hand. So it's going to be much more difficult for the South to finance this war than the North. The North has hundreds of banks, lots of gold reserves, liquid capital as they call it, available right at the beginning of the war, so they can begin financing the war right away without a whole lot of trouble. To further generate further revenue for the war, the North will rely on taxation and borrowing. Of course, they'll raise taxes to pay for the war. They'll borrow money in the form of government bonds, war bonds as they call them. And this is how the North will generate most of the money that it needs to fight the war. The South doesn't really, or Southern government, the Confederate government doesn't want to raise taxes on its people, so they will use their primary mode of raising money will be just to literally print more money. And this has a devastating effect on the Southern economy. Printing money without any kind of thing of any value to back up this money, basically it devalues the money. The more money you print, the less value it has, and inflation is the result of that. By the time we get to the end of the Civil War, we'll see inflation in the South reaching about 9,000%, and it's just outrageous. Confederate currency literally has no value by the time we get into that last year of the war, and you have soldiers paid in Confederate currency. You can't support their families because they just can't come up with enough cash to pay for even the most basic necessities to support their family. So everyone in the South is really going to be hit hard by this inflation. In the North, not so much so. We do see some inflation in the North. In fact, the federal government will engage somewhat in printing money, so we will see some inflation in the North, but not nearly on the same level as the South. By and large, the economy in the North remains pretty stable. Of course, we've got factories, generating resources, banking institution financing those resources, and of course, there's businesses making profits, selling things to the government, and so on and so forth. So the northern economy remains fairly stable throughout the war. So that's kind of a big deal. Military advantages we're talking about at the beginning of the war. Of course, northern industry has a capacity to produce large quantities of military equipment, but in the beginning of the war, those industries are not ready. It's going to take a while to get those industries working up to speed, converted to a wartime production. In the initial months of the war, though, the northern military has an advantage over the South in that it has far more artillery pieces, a lot more stockpiles of weapons and ammunition. And of course, artillery is one of the most important weapons on the battlefield. It's a mass casualty weapon. The more artillery pieces you have on the battlefield, the bigger advantage that you're going to have. And of course, the North has far more artillery than the South. At any rate, they will also have the capacity to produce more artillery. As they lose military hardware on the battlefield, they can always replace it with their industry. The South does not have this ability, or has far less of this ability. So we see in these quantitative advantages, in pretty much every way imaginable, the North has an advantage. However, these are only going to be an advantage in a long war. In a short war, a war that lasts only a few months or a year or so, very few of these things are going to be relevant. It's going to take industries or factories a long time to speed up production or to convert their production into wartime materials. It'll take a long time to get transportation resources choreographed and oriented to wartime missions. Same thing with financial institutions. It'll take a while to reallocate funds and make funds available, approve loans and that sort of thing in order to get the money rolling into the military production. It'll take time to recruit and train all these troops. Remember, at the beginning of the war, both armies were relatively the same size. So in a short war, very few of these things are going to come into play. Only if the war is long and protracted will these advantages really start to kick in. So when we look at the opening stages of the war, the North has a lot of potential advantage, but no immediate advantage. And that advantage really is going to belong to the South. The South has what we call a qualitative advantage. And if something is qualitative, it is more abstract, it is intangible, you can't see it or touch it, but it is no less real than a tangible or a quantitative advantage. We're talking about things like morale, public support, enthusiasm, motivation, leadership abilities, both political and military. These things can't really be quantified or expressed in a number. You can't see it or touch it, but it is real. As anyone who's ever served in the military or who's played sports can testify, morale is a very important aspect to your performance. If a soldier or athlete has a low morale, they're depressed and they're disillusioned and they're unmotivated, it's going to have a very real impact on their performance. Whereas a soldier or athlete who is highly motivated and enthusiastic and a very positive attitude, they're going to perform at a much higher level than another person. So these things are important, and the South has all of these in abundance. We talk about political and military leadership. As the Southern states seceded, some of the best generals and officers in the U.S. Army went back to their home states, which were Southern states, and joined the Confederate Army. So people like Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, these basically military geniuses, these strong, effective military leaders who were trained at West Point, who had years of experience in the U.S. Army. A lot of these officers are going to now be serving in the Confederate Army, and the numbers are significant. It's not quite half, but a significant number of these officers will return to their southern home states and serve in the Confederate Army. Political leadership is another one that's going to be very important. You don't just need officers that know what they're doing on the battlefield. You need political leaders who know how to orchestrate a war, to manage a nation's resources to the purpose of fighting a war. And when we look at political leadership in terms of presidents at the beginning of the war, Jefferson Davis versus Abraham Lincoln, we're inclined to think that the Confederate has a distinct advantage here. Jefferson Davis had far more political experience and military experience than Abraham Lincoln did. Jefferson Davis had served in the Mexican War as an officer. He had served in various political offices, from local government all the way up to federal government. His most recent office was that of Secretary of War under President James Buchanan. So Jefferson Davis has an extensive political and military background, whereas Abraham Lincoln doesn't have that. Lincoln did serve briefly in the military back in the 1830s, but he has no combat experience. He only served one term in office as a congressman in the House of Representatives from the state of Illinois, so he has very limited political experience as well. So if we were looking at this, just right at the beginning, and we had to pick we didn't know what happened next. We're at the beginning of this story, and we're trying to figure out which side has an advantage based on political leadership. We might be inclined to favor the South because Jefferson Davis has far more experience than Abraham Lincoln. But as it turns out, just the opposite was true. Despite his extensive experience, Jefferson Davis proved to be a somewhat ineffective wartime president, whereas Abraham Lincoln, again, despite his lack of experience, turned out to be a pretty effective wartime leader. His strategies and wartime goals were very instrumental in terms of leading the North to its success, especially the way Lincoln managed his generals. He held them to very high standards. He had his own ideas about the overarching strategy that the North would use to defeat the South, and he turned out to be a very effective wartime president. So there were some surprises here. Public support and morale. These are very important, and we touched on this when we were talking about the American Revolution. You cannot fight a war without public support. This is an essential element. Anytime a nation goes to war, it must have the support of its people in order to successfully wage that war. The South has almost universal support for its cause in this Civil War. Most of the people in the South, now not everyone, rarely do you see a situation where you have total universal support for any cause, but for the most part, the majority of Southerners support this war against the United States. Whereas in the North, support for the war, public support for the war is very low. Most people in the North don't really care. They're like, the average Northerner is like, look, I'm against slavery and all, but if the South wants to leave this badly, let them go. We don't need them anyway. They don't really provide anything for us. We can manage without them. Just let them go. Most people in the North are not very enthusiastic about this war. War is expensive. It's costly. You're taking men away from their jobs to send them to fight, and it just is no good is going to come from this. And what are we really fighting for? To keep the South as part of the Union. Why? So public support in the North is very low. A lot of people just don't care. In fact, there's some people that are against the war. They think it's going to be a waste of time. So it's going to be difficult for Lincoln administration to maintain an effective war effort without a lot of public support. So again, this is an important factor here, and the South has a distinct advantage over the North in terms of public support. Morale is the same way. Southerners have been preparing for this for years. In the minds of most Southerners, this is the best way to go, and they are all too happy to fight for it, for their cause, which they believe to be a just cause. So morale is high in the South. In the North, not so much so. A lot of the soldiers that are being recruited into the Northern Army are coming from the public, which doesn't really support the war. Some soldiers will join enthusiastically. Most will join, just because they think it's their duty, and a lot of them will join because they're drafted. Both sides will end up resorting to a draft in order to recruit military. The North more so than the South. And when you have a shortage of volunteers, you have to resort to a draft in order to fill up the ranks of your military. That's an indication of a general lack of public support. So in these qualitative advantages, the South has a very distinct advantage over the North. And this is going to be important in a short war. If the South can keep its morale high and take advantage of its military leadership and its widespread public support, they've got a lot of momentum right from the start. And it's going to take the North a long time to bring its advantages into play. And their lack of public support and morale in the opening stages of the war will put the North at a big disadvantage. So it depends on what happens in the war. If it's a short war, the South will have a distinct advantage. If it's a long war, if the South is unable to complete its goals in a short time, and the North has an opportunity to mobilize its resources, then the North is going to have a very clear advantage. One final thing to consider here is that the North has got the burden of conquest. And this is a military term here. You don't see this a lot outside of military science studies. The burden of conquest basically means that the North is going to have to go to the South to fight this war. The South has a home court advantage. We talked a little bit about this during the Revolution, whereas the American patriots were here on their own territory fighting a defensive war, basically, and the British had to send troops from Europe all the way to America to fight. So that's what they call the burden of conquest. And what that looks like here in the Civil War is that in order for the North to fight this war, in order for the North to put down this rebellion, they're going to have to send troops into the southern states in order to fight this war. So they've got to travel. They've got to travel by train or boat or troops marching. They have to travel long distances in order to get to the enemy. Whereas the southern armies, they just have to stay where they are, fight a defensive war. So, and of course, the further northern armies travel into the south, the more difficult it's going to become. And this is really why they call it the burden of conquest. As you conquer enemy territory, as you move further and further into enemy territory, your momentum begins to slow down. You have your supply lines, you get stretched out further and further, and you can't leave those supply lines unprotected. So you have to leave troops. You have to leave along this line of advance. You leave your troops spread out along this line to protect your supply lines, which means the number of troops you have at the lead of your offensive maneuver here is fewer and fewer. So your army becomes less and less effective the further it goes into enemy territory. This is the burden of conquest. And of course, all the enemy has to do is kind of regroup and surround you the further you get into their territory. So it makes the fighting becomes more difficult the further you get into enemy territory. And the North is going to be faced with this burden of conquest throughout the war. The South is never really going to have to deal with this, with the exception of Gettysburg, which we'll talk about in the next session. But for all intents and purposes, the South has an advantage here because the North has to travel to them in order to fight. During the Civil War, we see a lot of new technology showing up on the battlefield. Now, some of this is brand new technology that we'll talk about here in a minute. The field ambulance, aerial surveillance, those sort of things are brand new. Ironclad warships. But some of this technology has been around for a while. It's just now making its appearance on the battlefield to a significant degree. And one of these things is, of course, the telegraph had existed for a while. Photography's been around for about 30 years. Rifled weapons, one of our most important pieces of technology here. Rifle weapons have been around for years. But prior to the Industrial Revolution, rifled weapons were very expensive to produce. They're very time-consuming and tedious to produce. It costs a lot of money. Very few people could afford a rifled weapon. By the time we get to the Civil War, however, rifled weapons, thanks to the Industrial Revolution and things like mass production and interchangeable parts and so forth, rifle weapons can be produced rather economically to the point where almost every soldier on the battlefield, both North and South, will have a rifled weapon, both individual weapons and artillery. And what is the significance of a rifled weapon? Basically, what we're talking about here, without getting into a gunsmithing or ballistics technology, a rifled weapon is more accurate than a weapon that is unrifled. And we're talking about rifling, we're talking about the grooves on the inside of the barrel. So a rifled weapon will shoot much further, it has much greater range and much greater accuracy than an unrifled weapon, which means that soldiers will be able to hit their targets from further away, and they'll be able to hit more of what they're aiming at. How does this translate into bottom line? We're going to see a lot higher casualties in the Civil War than we've seen in any previous war, than in all previous wars combined. More people will be killed and wounded as a result of battlefield action than all the previous wars combined. In fact, the Civil War will be one of the deadliest wars in U.S. history. In fact, all the way up through the Vietnam era, the number of casualties in the Civil War will exceed the number of all the casualties in all the wars that the United States had ever fought in, up through and including Vietnam. So this is due largely to the proliferation of rifled weapons. Every soldier has a rifled musket. Every artillery battery is firing rifled artillery, and this equates into mass casualties. More people are hitting what they aim at from greater distances, and it really creates large numbers of casualties. It also forces armies to adjust their tactics. In the old days, the cavalry charge was used as kind of a turning point in a battle. At a certain point in the battle, the commander would bring in the artillery, or not the artillery, but the cavalry, and they would charge into the enemy position and break the lines, and of course that would turn the battle. With rifled weapons, soldiers can hit targets much further away. Artillery is more effective, much greater distances. So the cavalry charge is no longer effective. Soldiers can engage those cavalrymen, horse-mounted soldiers, from a lot further away, so the cavalrymen can't maneuver into a position where they can break the lines, and commanders are forced to revise their tactics. So while rifled weapons are not a brand new technology, it's shown up on the battlefield in large quantities for the first time during the Civil War. And of course, it will become the new standard in warfare with all subsequent wars. Let's take a look at a couple other things here as we go down the list. We talked about the railroads a lot, so we're not going to go into a lot of detail here, but as further evidence of how important the railroads are during the Civil War, the U.S. Army formed a U.S. military railway service, basically a regiment of soldiers whose sole purpose was to operate and maintain railroad equipment and railroad lines. Within its ranks, you had locomotive engineers and brakemen and locomotive mechanics, and of course crews of men who were specialized in building and maintaining railroad tracks and bridges. And of course the United States Army had all of its own railroad equipment too. So again, they have their own dedicated assets for railroad operations, separate from the private commercial railroad industry. So again, this indicates how important the railroad is. It was important enough to where the Army formed its own military railway units. And of course, trains are not just good for transporting troops and equipment. They're also good for moving oversized pieces of artillery or military weapons. In the case of this large cannon here, and again in this picture, these large oversized artillery pieces are far too heavy to be moved overland by horse-drawn vehicles. These guns they're so heavy they would sink up in the mud and they'd just be stuck on the battlefield and useless. But it's very easy for a train to maneuver these guns on a heavy railroad car like this. And of course, these guns have long range, several miles. So this gun doesn't even need to be on the battlefield. It can be positioned several miles away from the battlefield and still be an effective weapon. And of course, the railroad is ideally suited to move these large-scale artillery pieces. Both sides will make use of these large guns, but the North, again, has much greater capacity here for this to both produce and transport these guns. So we'll see a lot more of it on the northern side than the southern side. Ironclad warships, another distinctive feature of the Civil War. We see a combination of several different technologies here. We see steam-powered ship. Steam power, again, a product of the Industrial Revolution. Steam-powered ship as opposed to a sailing vessel. We see that there are no sails on this ship. It's all steam-powered. Well, we also see these large-scale artillery pieces, rifled guns, mounted on this warship, and as well as armor plating. We see the sides of the ship have been angled so as to deflect gunfire, and of course they're covered with large iron plates. So these ironclad warships, it's a wooden ship underneath, but it's just covered with iron plates. This is a turning point in naval technology, the first armored battleships. And this is a game changer in terms of military technology. Now, while during the Civil War, there's only one really major battle where the ironclad warships played a significant role. This is the Battle of Hampton Roads in the spring of 1862. Hampton Roads is in the Chesapeake Bay. Now, these ironclad warships did see action in other places during the Civil War, but this is the only major engagement where we see ironclad warships fighting each other. So, a United States ironclad against a Confederate ironclad, the Monitor and the Merrimack, facing off against each other in a naval engagement. Now, what's important about this? Now, this Battle of Hampton Roads was a significant battle, but the role of these ironclad warships was not an ultimate decisive factor here. But it's the beginning of a new era. Keep in mind, while this is the United States Civil War, there are no other participants in this war but the United States. Other countries are watching to see what happens. All the nations of Europe, especially the industrialized nations, England, France, and what will soon become Germany, they're watching what's going on here in this Civil War, and they're seeing things like this naval engagement between these new modern armored battleships. And they decide that, okay, this is the direction of the future, this is where naval warfare is headed. And not long after this, we see almost all of the industrialized nations begin building armored warships. So again, the Civil War is kind of a turning point in terms of naval technology, and it sets a new standard for how wars are going to be fought. And we'll see that too in other warfare too, and we talk about some of the significant battles in the next session, how some of these battles will, some of the strategies that are used kind of set the tone for the major engagements that they'll take place elsewhere in the world, the Franco-Prussian War, and then of course later on World War I, all will draw on tactics and strategies that are developed during the U.S. Civil War. Another piece of new technology is the field ambulance. Now, this looks kind of unassuming and not like a really important thing, but this has a significant impact in terms of life expectancy of battlefield casualties. In the old days, wars prior to the Civil War, when a soldier was wounded on the battlefield, he was very likely going to die of his wounds in the spot where he fell. Access to medical care was very limited. If you were wounded on the battlefield, you were pretty much on your own to make it back to the field hospital to seek medical care, or maybe you could get a buddy to help carry you back. But the battle's going on, and when you're wounded, you're kind of just there by yourself. In the Civil War, we see the first appearance of the field ambulance. Basically, this is a specially designed wagon, or designed specifically to carry soldiers on litters or stretchers. You know, there's some, you can't really see them, but there's racks inside the wagon to hold 2 to 4 soldiers on stretchers. So, and of course, our personnel here, Army medical personnel, these wagon drivers, and they're not really doctors. They just they can do some basic first aid, and their main function is to pick up the casualties and transport them to the field hospital, which is somewhere off the battlefield. So now that we have dedicated resources specifically reserved for transporting wounded soldiers to field hospitals, we see a much higher survival rate among wounded soldiers. In the Civil War, thanks to all those rifled weapons, you're very likely to be wounded seriously in the course of one of these battles. But unlike the old days, you are far more likely to survive your wounds as a result of the expedited retrieval of these wounded soldiers to the field hospital, where you're going to be seen by an actual doctor and an Army Nurse Corps, and of course the Red Cross also appears during this time frame. So in terms of caring for wounded soldiers, we see a lot of resources specifically dedicated to that purpose during the Civil War that didn't really exist in prior wars. Unfortunately, when we say you're going to be treated by a real doctor, that's true, but given the amount of casualties and the limited amount of doctors, pretty much the go-to treatment for wounds is amputation. You get shot in the arm or leg, in a hospital, a real hospital, they could probably extract a bullet and save your arm or your leg. In an Army field hospital, you've got one doctor who's responsible for treating hundreds, sometimes thousands of casualties. He doesn't have time to do the full treatment. He's just going to cut off your leg or your arm and sew you up just enough to save your life, but not enough to cause you to heal completely. So again, we see some improvements, but we also see some downsides to that as well. One last little piece of technology here, the hot air balloon. Was kind of a brand new technology at the beginning of the Civil War. A guy named Thaddeus Lowe in the spring of 1861 perfects his design for a hot air balloon. Basically, a canvas or silk bag filled up with hot air from a fire channeled into the balloon. Of course, this is a very primitive version of this hot air balloon, but it works. He finally got it to where it would work consistently, and it was big enough to transport a man aloft in this basket suspended under the balloon several hundred feet. Now, when it was first introduced, it was thought of as kind of a novelty. Okay, this make a great carnival attraction, but we don't see any practical use for this until the Civil War starts, and military leaders realized that this would be an excellent form of surveillance, battlefield surveillance. Instead of sending scouts riding out in all directions trying to locate the enemy position. We put one guy in this basket on this balloon, tethered to the ground, and we send him up in the air, 300 or 400 feet, and with a pair of binoculars, and have him observe the surrounding countryside. He can see for several miles away from his elevated position. And of course, he can see the enemy. I can see a formation of enemy troops. It looks like they're on the other side of the river, maybe a division or a battalion size, whatever. He can make these assessments from his vantage point. And of course, the balloon is tethered to the ground, so he's not drifting all over the place. Along the rope that's used to tether the balloon, there's a telegraph wire. Soldier in the top has a pair of binoculars. He's got a telegraph machine, and of course he is able to relay information down to another telegraph operator on the ground, who will of course write down the information and give it to the military commanders. And so they're getting information about enemy positions and what's going on in the battlefield much quicker than they were in the past. And this aerial surveillance gives a big advantage in terms of making decisions on the battlefield. Those generals in those rear camps who need to make decisions about where to move this battalion or that battalion, they don't have to wait for several days for their scouts to come back. They can get the information relatively quickly from these aerial observers. Both the North and South will make extensive use of this technology over the course of the war. We don't see any kind of a combat role here. These are restricted almost exclusively to surveillance. And of course, this is a precursor to the modern aerial drones, the unmanned aerial vehicles. These drones that are now a regular part of battlefield technology, observing the battlefield from the air. Of course, modern drones carry weapons as well as cameras. In the old days, though, it was just a guy in a basket with a pair of binoculars. At any rate, this is the dawn of aerial surveillance, new technology being incorporated into the battlefield. Finally, photography. Photography is not a new technology. Again, the first cameras started showing up in the 1830s, so this is old technology by the time we get to the Civil War. But it's used extensively on the battlefield for the first time. Cameras or photography was just kind of a novelty, an art form prior to the Civil War. The Civil War, though, we see photographers taking extensive photographic records of the battlefield. Now, cameras are bulky and hard to set up, so we don't see any live action shots or real-time photos. Most of the photos we see of the Civil War are in the aftermath of the battle. The battle's over, the photographer comes in and takes some pictures. What we see, though, and I chose this picture not because of its graphic nature, because there's a dead soldier here, but how crisp and clear this and of course this is a good example of, not all photographs in the 1860s were of this quality. This was a kind of a unique example, but the fact that this photograph is so clear, even by today's standards, you can see the texture on his wool blanket and on the bark on this tree, and of course the grass and the rocks. Everything is very clear in this image. The reason this is important is that for the first time in history, the average citizen gets an accurate portrayal of what war looks like. Prior to the Civil War, the general public had no real accurate impression of what war was like. There would be letters home and the journals written by soldiers. As a soldier writes a letter home, he'll tell about his experiences, how the war is hell, the battlefield is a scary place, men are dying and things are blowing up, but the words just don't do it justice, especially if the soldier is not very good at describing things. With a picture, however, a picture in the newspaper, people read this, they read the news article, they see this picture of what the effects of war actually look like, and it changes public perception of war. It becomes more real to the general public. You read about this in the newspaper, you see this picture, and you have this OMG moment, where you realize that how ugly and brutal war really is. It's not just something that happens off in the distance, some abstract idea. It's real. It affects real people, and it has a big impact on public opinion. And we'll see this from now on, from the Civil War forward in history, photography will be a major component of wartime documentation. In fact, by the time we get to World War I, World War II, the U.S. or all the armies of the world have battlefield photographers. They're soldiers in uniform. Their sole purpose is to document the battle with film. So this becomes an important piece of the historical record, is wartime photography. And it has a big impact on public opinion. All right, let's talk a little bit about some strategies and wartime goals of both sides here. This is important because when you're fighting a war, the reasons that you're fighting and how you plan to fight the war are of critical importance. There's the rationale that you use to gain support for the war. Here's why we're fighting this war. Here's our cause. Here's what we're fighting for, etc., etc. So your wartime goals are what you use to rationalize the war. This is why we're fighting. But the strategies basically talk about how you plan to accomplish these goals. And in the beginning, at the beginning of the war, the Confederacy had a much more clearly defined objective. They wanted to be free from the U.S. federal government. They wanted their independence, and that was their clear, definitive goal. And they had a good idea how they wanted to accomplish it. Just fight until they win it. The United States government, however, their goals or their strategies their goal was to preserve the Union, as identified or defined by President Lincoln. His goal was to preserve the Union, to keep the South from successfully seceding from the Union. How we're going to accomplish that, is a whole other matter. Initially, the Union strategy was somewhat disorganized. They knew they were going to have to go into the South to put down this rebellion, but they weren't quite sure how they were going to accomplish it. So we got a lot of ideas on the table initially. And Lincoln, of course, faced with having to sift through all these ideas, some of which were competing ideas, and decide what the overall strategy is going to be. One of the first strategies put forth was by Winfield Scott, and if you remember him from the Mexican War, he was one of the big generals in the Mexican War. Winfield Scott is an old man at this point. He's not going to ever see any more action. He's not going to set foot on the battlefield, but he still has a clear mind, and he's serving as kind of an advisor to the president. Scott says, and this image actually is from the Civil War. Scott, it appeared in a newspaper. Scott comes with this plan called Anaconda. And anaconda is just one of the various species of constricting snakes that wrap themselves around their prey and tighten their grip until the prey finally loses consciousness or suffocates. At any rate, Scott suggests this anaconda plan. Scott tells Lincoln, don't fight the South. Don't try and go down there and fight. That's going to be a mess. It's going to be ugly, brutal mess. It's going to be expensive. We're going to lose tons of casualties. It's better off to just choke them into submission, like a snake strangling its prey. So basically, Scott is saying here, you erect a naval blockade around the entire southern coast. And you just choke them off. You prevent them from exporting any cotton. You prevent them from importing any trade goods, and you just wait. Just wait for them to choke. Wait for them to surrender. And he said it's foolproof. It's guaranteed to succeed. Lincoln agrees. Lincoln said, "Okay, yeah, I agree with you, General Scott. I think this will probably work. However, this is probably going to take a long time for something like this to be effective. As a politician, Lincoln has promised the American people to bring about a swift end to this war and to restore the Union quickly. Scott's Anaconda plan is not going to produce that in a very timely manner. So Lincoln adopts what he calls a dual strategy: exhaustion and annihilation. We're gonna use Scott's naval blockade. That's gonna be part of it. But we're gonna try and wear out the South. Just keep the pressure on, wear them out, exhaust their resources, exhaust their manpower, and to the point where we can eventually just annihilate them on the battlefield whenever we have the opportunity. Otherwise, just keep the pressure on and wear them out. Also, Lincoln wants to employ this simultaneous advance. And this is not something that the military has ever really put into practice. Basically, looking again at our map here, the simultaneous advance. You're going to attack in multiple places at the same time. Traditionally, armies will fight in one spot to achieve a decisive victory, and then they'll go to another spot and try to do the same thing. Lincoln says that'll take forever, because all the South, every time we attack in a new spot, the South just has to reposition and defend. If we can attack the South in multiple locations at the same time, here in the east, toward the Confederate capital, Richmond, in the center, down through the middle of Kentucky and Tennessee, and over here on the west, along the Mississippi River, we can attack the South in multiple places simultaneously, and then keep that pressure on. It'll exhaust the South. It'll wear them out. They won't be able to maintain this pace for very long. And of course, a naval blockade combined with this simultaneous advance and exhaustion and annihilation, Lincoln believes that this will bring about the quickest end to the war. Of course, that's assuming that everything goes according to plan, which it never does. Keep in mind that the South has a much simpler strategy here. They're fighting a defensive war. In the minds of Southerners, both the people and the military leadership, they don't need to invade the North to win. All they need to do is to defend their territory against a Northern advance. Force the Northern armies to travel, to stretch out their supply lines and resources. And then that gives the South the advantage of fighting on their home territory. And of course, Southern generals know that as long as they keep fighting, then they're still in the game. And this is kind of George Washington style thinking here. Just like Washington knew that he didn't have to defeat the British Army, he just had to keep them fighting for long enough to where eventually they would get tired and go home. Southern generals are using this same sort of strategy. They figure as long as they can keep fighting, eventually the already low enthusiasm and support that the general public has in the North will begin to diminish rapidly, and that once the public loses all support for this war, that the U.S. government will have no choice but to call it off. So all they have to do is keep fighting, and they'll eventually achieve their goal. Again, here looking at the same map, from the southern perspective, they don't have to go anywhere. They just have to defend their territory. Yeah, they're going to have to spread out their forces along a long front here to defend against multiple attacks at the same time. But all they have to do is defend. They just have to hold out. They don't have to advance. They don't have to conquer territory. They just have to hold their ground. And that's a lot easier to do than to maintain a long-distance offensive campaign. Now, they do attempt a couple times to try to launch an offensive campaign. Gettysburg is the one big exception here to the Southern strategy. An opportunity presented itself, so Southern generals saw a chance to strike into Northern territory, and they tried to take advantage of that. And we'll talk about that when we get to the Battle of Gettysburg. But so in terms of their strategies, both North and South have very different strategies. Northerners are fighting an offensive campaign. They have the burden of conquest. They have to strike into Southern territory in order to fight this war. All Southerners have to do is to defend their territory. So even though the Southerners kind of started this war, they adopt a defensive posture very early on, and that kind of gives them advantage in the first year or so of the war. One of the reasons why when we come back in the next session, we talk about key battles. Pretty much for the first whole year of the war, everything goes in favor of the South. The South win a lot of key battles. Most of the attempts of the Northern armies to invade the South are repelled by Southern victories. So we'll pick it up there when we come back in the next session. We'll talk about some of those key battles and how these strategies play out, and of course who ultimately wins. Spoiler alert: the North wins. At any rate, we'll also discuss how the issue of slavery plays into this war. We'll talk about the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment and how the war comes to an end. So we'll pick it up there next time with the final chapter in our story of early U.S. history.